Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Donna Gustafson. I'm the interim director and the curator for American art at the Zimmerle Art Museum at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. With my colleague, Professor Gerry Beegan of the Department of Art and Design at Rutgers, I co-curated the exhibition, Angela Davis Sees the Time, which is on view at the Zimmerle through June 15th, 2022. It will travel to the Oakland Museum of California and be on view there from October 8th, 2022 to June 11th, 2023. Please see the museum websites for further details of the exhibition and programming at the Zimmerle Art Museum and also at the Oakland Museum of California. Next slide, please. Angela Davis Sees the Time is centered on a rich archive of material that includes magazines, posters, booklets, flyers, records, legal documents, and court sketches collected by the Oakland-based activist and archivist Lisbet Tellefsen. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. This material is intertwined with works of art that speak to Angela Davis's historical impact and continued importance in radical intersectional thought and her activism around prison abolition. And next slide, please. And next slide. This productive tension, this movement backwards and forwards between past and present, between historical document and art, troubles our ideas around archives and history. Next slide, please. And next slide. And the next slide, please. 3 archival events was organized by Gerry Beegan as a celebration of the archive and our exhibition. The exhibition is a starting point, but these 3 conversations about archives in history, art, and sound encompass a wide net. We hope that these discussions will inspire individuals and groups to activate existing archives and will also spur memory work within local communities. Tonight's subject is Issues in Black Archival Work. Join us on Friday, October 22nd from noon to 1:30 p.m., and that's Eastern Standard Time, for artists and archives. And on Thursday, October 28th from 7 to 8:30 p.m., again, Eastern Standard Time, for Archiving the Invisible, Black Sonic Archives. You will need to register separately for each of these sessions. Before I hand over the event to our moderator, Dr. Alexandria Russell, I would like to thank our donors. This program is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. Grant funding has also been provided by the Middlesex County Board of County Commissioners through a grant award from the Middlesex County Cultural and Arts Trust Fund. The event is being recorded and will be shared on the Zimmerle's YouTube channel. Our moderator will be fielding questions, so please submit any questions for the panel using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We will get to as many of your questions as we can. Thank you, Gerry, for organizing these exciting panels. Thank you to our Curator of Education, Amanda Potter, for her work tonight in support of tonight's event. And now, let me introduce Dr. Russell. Alexandria Russell is currently a research fellow for Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, where she coordinates the digital humanities projects for the Presidential Initiative. From 2019 to 2021, she was the postdoc fellow for the Scarlet and Black project that recovers the multicultural history of Rutgers University. Her book project, Sites Seen and Unseen, Mapping African-American Women's Public Memorialization, examines the evolution of African-American women's public commemorations across the United States from the late 19th century to the present. She earned a BA in political science and a BS in secondary education from the College of Charleston in 2009. In 2018, she received her Ph.D. in history from the University of South Carolina, and she has been awarded several fellowships to support her research, including a W.E.B. Du Bois Center Summer Postdoctoral Fellowship at University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Russell.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you, Donna, and all of the organizers of this event at the Zimmerly. I am beyond excited for this wonderful conversation. I am anticipating just a really robust and vivid discussion of issues in Black archives. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists that we have this evening. Our first panelist is Lisbet Tellefsen. Lisbet Tellefsen is an Oakland, California-based community archivist, collector, curator, and publisher. Her archives and collections range from political posters to Black LGBT culture to Angela Davis and the Black Panther Party. Almost 300 pieces from her archive form the bulk of the exhibit, Angela Davis Sees the Time, open now at the Zimmerly Art Museum at Rutgers University. Welcome to you, Lisbet.
Hello, it's great to be here.
And now we have Tracy Drake. Tracy Drake is the Director of Special Collections and Archives at Reed College, focused on acquiring, preserving, and providing access to the historical and cultural records of the college. As an information professional, Tracy strives to provide equitable access to the stories of the Black experience. She believes in confronting difficult topics in our collective historical record while encouraging community archival practice. She is a graduate of Eastern Illinois University with a BS in African American Studies, an MA in History from Roosevelt University, and an MS in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. In 2018, she was chosen as a member of the American Library Association Class of Emerging Leaders. Her scholarship and research focused on anti-racism in society and information. Welcome, Tracy, to our panel.
Thank you. So great to be here. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we have Zakiya Collier. Zakiya Collier is a Brooklyn-based Black queer archivist and memory worker. Her work with African diaspora and community-based collections includes leading the #Schomburg Syllabus Project as the digital archivist at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, designing, co-leading, and securing grant funding for the Linking Lost Jazz Shrines project at Weeksville Heritage Center, and consulting on the organization and preservation of Marilyn Nance's FESTAC, FESTAC 77 collection. She holds an MA in Media, Culture, and Communication from New York University, an MLIS from Long Island University, and a BA in Anthropology from the University of South Carolina. Zakiya is an affiliate of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies at New York University, an interim board member of the Archival Education and Research Initiative, and a guest co-editor of a forthcoming special issue of the Black Scholar on Black archival practice. Welcome to you, Zakiya.
Thank you, Dr. Russell. Nice to be here, everyone.
So in thinking about all of these issues in Black archives, I mean, where do we start? There's so much that we can discuss, but I think that the best way to kick off our conversation is to think about this wonderful exhibition that the Zimmerly has on Angela Davis. And that means there's no better place to start our conversation than with Lisbet. So one of the things that I found very interesting that you've said is that you are a treasure hunter gatherer. And I just love that term. So I want you to tell our audience, how did you become or come into being a treasure hunter gatherer? What does that mean? And how did this process of collecting all of these wonderful pieces begin for you?
Ooh,
Good question, I know.
you know, I will say that maybe about 10 years ago, I was asked to do a collector talk. The Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco had an exhibit about collections, and they included a talk with the people who created these collections on how it got started. And it was the first time I really kind of looked at my backstory And there were a few threads that were completely random, but were central to my path. Number one, I grew up in the 60s, which was really the golden era of collecting. You know, our parents collected blue chip stamps, S&H stamps. Every time you went to the gas station, the closest shop to where we lived in Berkeley was a hobby shop. And, you know, I think when you go to the seeds of where did I develop tenacity and resourcefulness and basically the ability to make imprudent financial decisions, you know, it goes back to my 6-7-year-old self. And being a collector is different than becoming an archivist. The second little nugget, which is also completely random, is that I come from an international background. So I spent a lot of time as a kid flying to places where I didn't speak the language. And as a 6-7-year-old, I began using external objects as memory. You know, there was a lot of things happening. I couldn't keep track of it all. And so I had this little suitcase where I would gather mementos from my journey. And when I was home, I would lay them out of my bed and kind of put them in chronological order. And thirdly, I was raised in a village of activists and organizers, all of whom, I was the little kid that would go hang out with my grandfather's circle, which included folks like Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson, Louise Thompson Patterson. And while they would be having their grown-up conversations, I would find the room with the TV set, which was always full of books and art on the walls and just overflowing with, you know, the vestiges of their life. And I just kind of thought, oh, that's how you do it. You know, you go out into the world and you gather your collections and you live with your personal archives. And my godfather figure, Matt Crawford, was also the keeper of the papers for all the organizations that he was active in. Things like the National Negro Congress, the Council for Civic Unity. In 1932, he was one of a group of young African Americans that went to the Soviet Union to make a film on Black life in the US. That group included Langston Hughes, Louise Thompson Patterson. And when he was in his 90s, he asked for my help to kind of organize his papers. That may have been the first time I heard the word papers or really thought about what that would be. And he was desperate to write a book. You know, he was getting older, and I kept trying to organize this material in some way that would be helpful to the project. And he ended up passing before he was able to get that over the finish line. And that haunted me. And so the question of how do we use external material from a person's life to actually be able to tell that life story. And that was in the 90s. And in maybe the early 2000s, I'm a poster collector and I meet other poster collectors, and we formed this collective called the Political Poster Portal. And we decide we're going to digitize our collection. And to make it sexy for me, they said, why don't we start with our Angela Davis posters? Now, this predates Google Images and things like that, but between the three of us, we had maybe 50 Angela Davis posters. And we had this set up where we shot archival Kodachrome, and my job was to get them digitized. And I remember getting these DVDs of images back and seeing 50 Angela Davis posters all at once. And, you know, the little collector geek in me, which is like, this has never been done before. It's the first time in history, you know, all of that. And as I started to look at all these images, I had the idea of, let me just print them out and put them in a binder so I don't have to, it was really wieldy to do all that on a desktop. And as I put them in a binder, it began to take on a life of its own. Like I'm looking at these posters and I put them in my best chronological order. And then as newspapers went online, I started to go to some of the newspaper archives and print out related articles. And then as newspapers started to liquidate their photo morgues, they were dumping tons of Angela Davis photographs. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I snapped up thousands of Angela Davis and Black Panther photographs and digitized them and put them in this binder, which became this kind of memory project. And I just began, I got a little obsessed with finding more material because it was like putting this journey back to life like a jigsaw puzzle. And because I've known Angela for so long, I mean, we're probably going on 40 years now. I had access to her to show her this project. And I wish I had been able to figure this out when my godfather was alive, because literally I am watching as she is paging through a binder. You can see her brain like dialed down. There's this one story that I have to tell because it's just indicative. So she's going through this binder and comes across a photograph of when she was incarcerated on a hunger strike. Jet magazine had come in and done an interview with her, and the pictures that were published had her so gaunt, and her hair was crazy, and it was just not a good look for the American prison system. And she turns to my partner, Erica Huggins, who's there, and says, Erica, do you remember this? When this article came out, it caused such an international outcry that one day you were outside the jail and they asked you to come in and gave you a pair of scissors so you could give me a haircut. And I mean, I was kind of stunned because I had just witnessed something being unlocked that I know was a memory that someone who has been interviewed a gabillion times has never remembered before. And so I bought into this project, and I feel like there's a way where my backstory kind of led to this. But these days I do a lot of work developing people's papers. I call myself a movement archivist, but I'm probably more accurately an archivist for movement figures, many of whom don't believe they have papers. And I'm like, au contraire, we're gonna do something about that. And yeah, I've worked with the papers of Black lesbian poet Pat Parker. I just brought the Brock and Dolores Peters papers to Emory University. You know, just a number of different projects like that. But I feel like at this stage, I get paid to preserve history that's important to me, you know? And so I do feel like a treasure hunter-gatherer. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And I mean, it's beautiful to hear your journey, because I know you mentioned there's a difference between a collector and an archivist, and you've kind of taken us through that process for you that started at a young age, from being a collector to archivist. And I think that's really nice. I want to think a little bit more about the Angela Davis collection. And I'm wondering, you know, the story that you just shared was so beautiful. and, you know, really kind of getting that memory trigger when you see a particular image, you're reminded of something. And I want to know, you know, based on your relationship with Angela Davis, how is it, or how has it been, or what have some of the challenges been to archiving or collecting this larger than life iconic figure? How do you get the person behind that? How do you get the person that you know who's kind of behind the iconography? And you know, how has this collection really spoken to the personal side of her that people might not get to see all the time?
Ooh, well, I would say for most of the time, you know, archiving Angela's life is very separate from a relationship with Angela. I will say that the process of gathering all this material and going through all these stories, which probably also represent, you know, the darkest moment in her life, it's a very personal and intrusive process. And that's not something that I bring to her. You know, we talk about yoga and dogs, you know. And there's also a way where I would say the bulk of my archive also doesn't really, you know, it tends to be focused on those chapters which an extraordinary output of material happened in her life, like between maybe 69 and 74, something like that. And, you know, I'm much less concerned with telling a complete story of her life. You know, I really think of every little piece that I bring in is a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. You know, I don't know that I will ever complete that puzzle. And I'm also more focused on creating a rich resource that others can mine for the stories. You know, I'm not the scholar, I'm not the academic, but I am creating a rich, rich, rich treasure trove of material that others can then use. You know, it's like half the time when I create my folders, I'm thinking about someone who's going to request it 50 years down the line and are going to get a nice surprise because maybe the folder won't be opened until then. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things. I love how you say that you're putting the jigsaw, the puzzle pieces together, because it's one of those things when young people look at these posters and look at this particular collection, I mean, they're going to be able to think about how this history has really impacted their own lives and continues to do so. So I really, really admire that. And, you know, we're going to talk about professionalization and those types of things as well. But I mean, your contributions are clearly invaluable, and, you know, historians and those alike would not be able to do what they do without the preservation efforts of people.
That's
just
what I
like
want to hear.
so, so I want to pivot just a little bit, and I have some questions for Tracy. And one of the questions, you know, in thinking about being a treasure hunter gatherer, you know, myself to some extent, I have lots of stuff in my home. And some people are saying that, you know, we're pushing minimalism. If something doesn't spark joy, then you need to declutter and get rid of it. And so I want to know, from your standpoint, what is some practical advice that we can give people who are hearing kind of this public discourse about decluttering? And, you know, as a historian and as archivists, we want people to save things. So what do you say to people? How do we balance, you know, minimalism, decluttering, and preserving invaluable documents that, again, 50, 100 years from now, we will need to document our history?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think that's a really good question, and one I think that as a profession we need to think about, and as individuals in our own families when we think about our own familial history, right? Um, and I think I'm sure what archivists and Black memory workers, if I could speak for the collective right now, which is probably a mistake because everyone wouldn't probably agree with me, but I think what like folks are advocating for is not only like collecting materials related to like Black joy, but merely the recognition of that Black people live full lives and have experiences of every emotion and connection possible. And yet I think in the archives, we have tended to focus on narratives that center trauma. So if we want to think about the current period in which we're in, right, the uprisings that occurred over the summer, there was a lot of call outs to just collect material related to like COVID-19. But I think we have to be very intentional because we are full people who live full lives, and that not get so caught up on focusing on trauma. So like, I'll give an example from my own institution, which is, right, a small, predominantly white liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon. And every time we try to tell the story of the Black experience at Reed College, what we always talk about the Black experience is through the lens of like the Black Studies protest here on campus. And while that's an important part of like the students' Black experience here on campus during the 1960s, I also want to know, like, I think it's problematic because it also only sees us as one-dimensional. And I think what all the other questions that we should be asking ourselves is, and some of our colleagues probably would say the same thing too, is that we need to be intentional to recognize Black folks' humanity. And some of the questions that I want to know is, like, I want to know how folks created community on campus. Like, what does joy look like in your community, right? What was the candy store lady's name in your neighborhood, right? What was Sundays like? For me, Sundays meant listening to Herb Kent, the cool gent, right? And with my family driving down Lakeshore Drive. And so what materials can I save to help tell that narrative and that story? So I think Lisbet was right, all of these objects evoke emotion and memories that are connected to them. And I think that we should also be thinking about that and collecting with intentionality, right? So when I'm at home, those are the things that I should be thinking about. And I think that once you tell those individual familial histories, like that also connects us to this larger Black narrative. So yeah, but I also want to say, like, to add to that is that we are in a time of like information overload, and we also have to be okay with not being able to save everything. We have to say that perhaps for the sake of privacy, we shouldn't be saving everything, right? Like, some folks have a right to privacy. And then also, I think that we're not going to be able to save everything because we just will not. So, and we just have to reconcile with that as a community of people.
Such excellent points. And you just sparked my memory of the candy lady after school and after church. I mean, she was golden. Served a critical need in my childhood. But I'm also thinking, speaking of my childhood, I mentioned this to you before, and I'll share this with the audience. My family is from Charlotte, North Carolina, and we have a family home there. And one of the things my great aunt Ella used to always do was collect photographs. And there was like a family wall of pictures from way back when, before I was born, all the way up to baby pictures, school pictures. And I never thought of that space, or I never thought of her as a collector. I never thought of her, cutting out newspaper articles. My great aunt Helen was the Charlotte Beauty of the Week. And I never thought of her as preserving kind of our family legacy. And I'm wondering, what do you say to the Aunt Ellas that are in our families across the nation, you know, what are some of the things that we can tell them in order to preserve? Because you know, there was no acid-free paper, you know, there was none of that. And I probably need to get down there and to work on that collection. But what are some practical things for me, for other people who have these family collections? How can we preserve this and be intentional, as you say, about preserving aspects of our lives that don't focus necessarily on trauma and, you know, the long struggle for Black liberation?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I'm gonna try to answer it as best I can. But I think, right, everybody has a family historian. Like my mother is our family historian, and I think that's kind of how I got into like this archives practice, just through her sharing her stories. And I think it's just really important, and part of the work that we've been doing as a part of the group that I also am a part of, the Blackivist. So it's a group of trained Black archivists, which is also something amazing within itself, because the fact that 6 Black archivists were in the same space at the same time, we're in the field that is 87% white. And it has been that way since I entered in 2015. So as a part of the Blackivist, what we've done is host through community partners. We've hosted archiving days where we went in and talked to individuals and families about how to preserve what are some tips, because everybody won't be able to go to school, right? Everybody won't go and get a master's degree in LIS. That's just not going to happen. So how can we give you small tips? We would just think through on how we could give you small tips on like preserving your history. So that means like sometimes we go in and we survey spaces, because I heard so many times from individuals in our community, oh, I had my stuff in the basement and the basement flooded, right? I hear that so often, and it's like devastating to hear the loss of some of the material just through basic material like that. So we'll go in and we'll survey like a house and we'll say, hey, keep these photographs away from light, so keep it in a dark space. If you have to store it in the basement, put it on a higher level so that it's not on the ground, because that decreases the likelihood that it will be touched by water. We've seen stuff that has been damaged by water, so we do provide consultations on that. Once at one of the events, there was an elder who I absolutely love, and I will always share this story because it made me cackle. But she actually stored her photographs in a box, in like a clear, like one of those plastic bins. But she stored them in mothballs. And she was like, I stored it in mothballs. And I was like, I can smell it. and so I explained to her that this wasn't perhaps the best way to store her photographs. And she didn't necessarily believe me. So I brought in another Black member of the Blackivist to explain that process to her. She still didn't believe us. She was just kind of like, who are these youngins telling me how to, you know what I'm saying? And so she also has, I brought in a third member and she finally believed us. But I think the more we're able to share like these small ways that you can keep your treasure safe without spending, like I like to call it on a shoestring budget, I think that we'll be in better shape for how we can preserve Black history and culture for the long run. And like I'm always really excited about the stories we share. And so we also tell folks, have more than one copy, right? In archives, we try to follow the 3-2-1 rule, where we'll start you off like at some of our archiving events with digitizing some of the photos, and also coming up with what we call name conventions. Instead of naming your photo 1, 2, 3, I've seen that, which doesn't tell you information that you need in order to look for it later or realize what photo you have. So I think it's about like figuring out the small ways in which we can help prevent like preservation disasters from happening, because those small stories tell a much larger story of narrative of Black history, and they're all important. So.
Yes, I mean, those are some really practical tips that I think everybody can participate in. And, you know, it starts at home. It starts with our own families and our own communities and the people that we know, so that we'll be able to have a rich and full narrative or documentation decades and centuries down the line. So thank you for those practical tips. I'm really surprised, and I didn't know that 87% of the profession was white. I don't know why I'm too surprised, but I want to shift gears and talk to Zakiya a little bit more about the professionalization and the institution of Black archives across the country. And I'm thinking about, I'm wondering if you can actually talk a little bit about how do we change that 87%? How do we expand educational opportunities, professional opportunities for those who are interested in doing this type of work? And how do we, really reach into the younger generation and let them know that this is a significant part of our future?
Thank you. I think that's such a great question. And because the profession continues to be 87% white, I think it is a question that is always sort of on our minds for the Black folks that are here in our profession. And I think just like the conversation about how do we preserve these materials and, sort of with Lisbet being treasure hunter gatherer, I think this work starts at home, right? Like it starts in the community with affirming students, younger people with their own collections, right? Like letting them know that they have a life to document. And, we are, like you mentioned, in this age of minimalism, and we're also in an age where not a lot of people are in stable homes. We don't, millennials and Gen Z owning homes is like when, how, what money with this debt are you like, no. And so, there's, sort of the displacement and being all over the place. And I live in New York, I've lived here 5 years. I've moved 3 times. So like, and I have moved with my archives, but most people would not, like I have a storage unit, I have this, I have that, but most people would not do that. And so I think when speaking with our youth, it's like giving them ideas of what they can keep and what they can do to document themselves, to let them know sort of the process of how history is created and how history is documented and written. I think, for myself, growing up, like, I think it would have been mind blowing if like in history class, the teacher actually talked about how this image made it into the history book, like who collected this photo? Where does it live now? Which archives? Can I go there? Can I go look at it? Can I touch it? Like hearing all of those steps behind it, like, yes, we took, trips to the museum. But even then there was no sort of backstory of like how these items got here. It was just like, oh, that's really cool. That's from, 1755. But, someone had to do the work to preserve it, to conserve it, when it was damaged, or, the fact that this item travels from institution to institution. So like the advocacy around the profession and the education about the work that we do has to start early. I think, for myself, I didn't hear the word archives until I was a senior in college. And I was like, I really love this stuff, but like, why didn't anybody tell me about this earlier? And so it's always amazing when I do talk to kids and they're like, what do you do? And I tell them and they're like, Arca what? And I'm like, archivist. And we kind of, talk through what I actually do. And, it's about 50-50. Some of them are like, okay, cool. And, the other ones are like, wow, I would love to do something like that. Just in the past year, I've met several teenagers who people have been like, they're interested in doing what you do. I talked to them about it, and they want to do what you do. Can you, meet with them? And I'm like, teenagers, that's amazing. And so I think that's sort of the first part, is just general advocacy and making it known that like the labor that we do, and that students and kids can partake in that in their own homes. Some of us come to it naturally, like Lisbet, like myself, but others of us are like, not thinking about, oh, I should save this program because I gave a speech to the 5th grade class, So just letting them know, like, when you're, 45, you're going to be like, what was that speech about? And then you can actually go look at it. And so I think that's one part, sort of on the professional side, especially when thinking about diversifying and having more Black people in the profession. There's that advocacy and giving opportunities for Black students to sort of work in the library, to work with the materials, to, sort of have archival ambassadors of sorts, where they can kind of think about, like, if I had to document, the class of 2021, what are the important items that I would keep, something from homecoming, something from, the protests at the beginning of the year, and the changes that were made in our correspondence with administration during that protest, the joys, the traumas, the things that you think nobody is even thinking about, just kind of having those conversations with students about documenting themselves and how that will live in a university archive. And I think one of the most important parts of that is like paying students to do that work and to do that intellectual work, whether they're working with physical collections, they're doing research projects, finding ways to pay them to actually do work with the archives, and then finding ways to train them in the work that we do. I want to shout out some programs that are, ongoing. Johnson C. Smith has a project called Diversity Archivists Partnership Program, where they sort of partner with other HBCUs and introduce students to preservation, to archiving, digital preservation. And I got a chance to speak with some of the students a few weeks ago, and just like the way their minds were blown that whatever their major was could interact with the archive in some way, just being or archives and libraries, but being yes, you're a child development major. They're child development librarians. You can think about how to document children and how that lives in the archive. There's an engineering student, and being the tools and software that we use are created by engineers. We don't create that, a good portion of the people that work in the library may have engineering degrees. And so just exposure is so incredibly important. And so that's one program that the work is actually being done at HBCUs where, that needs to happen. And there used to be a couple of schools that HBCUs that had library science programs, but do not any longer. So doing that work with undergrad students is so important. Another project is Project Stand, which is a consortium, so sort of different institutions that have come together to really think about documenting student activism on campus. And they have a toolkit that actually sort of has questions that archivists should be asking of students, but also questions that students should be asking of archivists to make sure that their story is, that they're being ethically documented and that they are part of the storytelling about their experience. So I think, sort of having that outreach and tools for students to really think about, oh, my experience is going to be told in the archive. What would it be like for me to partake in that and maybe later become, a university archivist to help to tell the stories of other students? And so creating resources for students to really understand this, having open archives events where they can kind of come in and learn about the work we do. you know, as best you can with the infrastructure, you know, having glass so they can actually see like, what do these people do in these offices, you know, but having open doors, open windows, so they can kind of see that like, we just don't like sit there and twiddle our thumbs. Like there is work being done. There's like thought processes around how to organize, how to make accessible. And so, yeah, I think that just really opening up the space and making sure that people know that we exist and that it's a possibility for them as well, whether it's in the profession or in whatever they decide to do, you know, they can still have some connection to the archive and archival work.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. Thank you. And it never occurred to me that you could encourage students who are interested in STEM or engineering to be a part of Black Archives. I mean, that's really, really wonderful. I want to encourage our audience to submit questions. We're going to open it up for audience Q&A in just a little bit. One of the things that I was also struck by what you said is that that young people, they have a life to document. And, you know, they have a life worth documenting, and they often do it, you know, via TikTok or other mediums. But again, that advocacy and letting them know, you know, preserve it in maybe multiple forms is a way to, you know, have your life story told decades down the line. So really thought that was beautiful. The other question that I want to ask you in terms of the profession is if you could speak a little bit to kind of the undergirdings of the scholarship of Black archivism. I know that you are going to be a co-editor of the Black archival practice issue of the Black Scholar. And I wonder if you could let our audience know what we can expect in that issue. What are some of the academic debates that we might find interesting that are happening in the world of Black archives right now?
Great. Another great question. Yeah, let me first just say I'm like really excited and like super stoked to even be a part of this special issue, and just like knowing the history of the Black Scholar, and you know, even having come across like original issues from like, you know, from the beginning at the Schomburg Center and being like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna like be in one of these as the co-editor. It's such a privilege and honor. And I think this sort of this special issue with my co-editor, Dr. Tanya Sutherland, who's at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. You know, this kind of came together out of our kind of a little bit of like a double consciousness. So like W.E.B. Du Bois, like really being Black and being in archives. And so sort of having, you know, this 87% white profession that, you know, whiteness permeates our principles, the way the profession was created, you know, the way that power is maintained and documented throughout the archival profession. So sort of being a part of that and witnessing that, but then also recognizing that the way we live our lives as Black people sometimes contradicts with what we're being told in the profession about what's important to document and how to document it. And thinking like, you know, if that's the way that we do it, people that are important to me will never end up in the archive. My mom will not end up there because she has not published anything. You know, all of her important materials, she would never give to an institution because she don't like people in her business. So, but that doesn't mean that, you know, it's not worth documenting. That doesn't mean that she doesn't have important stories to tell and that she hasn't done significant work for her communities and for the people around her, even if the only person she's impacted, you know, are her children and her family members. That is valuable and worth recognizing and documenting. And so you sort of recognizing that and kind of seeing that conversation happen everywhere but in the profession, except for like in conversation, but like archival studies scholarship is not talking about that contradiction when it comes to Black people. And so being like, we see this conversation happening because we're reading Black Studies scholarship and we're talking to Black people. We're reading historical scholarship on slavery and seeing that sometimes there are different methods that are necessary to tell the stories about Black people because of the number of things that we encounter on a daily basis, whether it's dispossession or oppression, and just recognizing the need for different methods. And so sort of being like, okay, let's be intentional and actually have this conversation where we acknowledge that different methods are necessary, and having different voices coming in from the archival profession, but also from different disciplines, to come together and say, here's one example of Black archival practice. This is how it shows up in my work or in my life. So sort of our conversation about your Aunt Ella, and about different people and how how hoarding can be coded as, like a bad thing. Looking at TV, it's like, something's wrong with you. But for people who have been told they're not important and their materials have not been documented, hoarding might be the only way that, they are acknowledging and affirming their life and their families. And maybe no one else will keep that, but Aunt Ella has a copy of, that Jet magazine or anything else, and it like makes me think of like conversations with my mom, and she's like, yeah, I have that and I have this, and I'm just like, I wonder if that exists anywhere else. I don't know, but just affirming that is sometimes what we have to do, to make sure that we're documented. Somebody had to keep it. And so, yeah, I think just what you can expect to see is just different conversations from a multitude of disciplines, really thinking about what the practice of preserving Black life and experiences can look like, and showing just the nuance and diversity in what that looks like, whether it's in the profession, because the profession doesn't always get it right. Inside scoop, in case anybody didn't know, we do not always get it right, especially when it comes to Black materials. And so just introducing people to the number of ways that can show up, and having it all in one place is also incredibly important. You see it in a lot of scholarship, whether, Sadia Hartman, Marissa Fuentes, your work, Dr. Russell, you see it all over the place, but kind of having a space that actually acknowledges the methodologies that people are taking and exploring, I think is so necessary, both for the Black Studies side and for the archival side, and also to kind of bring those two things together and say, hey, you over here, there's Black archivists, we're doing this work in here, and then to to the archival profession being like, hello, you're not the only people talking about archives, there are historians, there are lawyers, there are, humanists, all over, everybody, let's come together and talk about, the value and the work that is necessary for Black archives.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, one of the things that is still ringing in my ears is that, we have lives that are worth documenting. We have materials that are worth saving. And it's, in many cases up to us to do that, because we're still pushing back against institutions who simply say that we're not worth saving, we're not worth preserving. So thank you for that. That was really, really beautiful. And we have a lot of work to do to break down that 87%. I'm going to encourage people to enter questions. We do have one question for Lisbet, and this is from Louise Sandhaus. She says, Lisbet, I'm wondering in what form you're documenting the conversations you're having with Angela Davis, particularly when she's when she is responding to materials in your archive as you describe?
So there's a way in which when I'm interacting with Angela around archives, those are events that specifically that's what we're there to do. I kind of don't mix and match. And so when we're working with one of her archival binders or something like that, I will always record. So, you know, I have a large digital archive, and, you know, if there's a circumstance where it's not really appropriate to record, I'm someone who, if something, you know, extraordinary happens, or I'm trying to remember something, I will go home and journal about it. So, you know, I will always record if possible. If not, I will do my best either that night or the next day to try and write down what I remember. And, you know, I treat my own life and these sorts of interactions like the same jigsaw puzzle. Like, for example, what's the name of that? Online Scrabble or something. Angela and I were playing online Scrabble, and I was kicking ass. And I started to shit talk. And on the last turn, she pulled it out. And I was like, you know, it was a short text thread, but I screenshot that game and I printed out the text chat. So 50 years from now, there would be a folder where someone will be like, what the fuck? I'm like, you know. So, you know, I document in any way that I can, but I do my best to capture, you know, and preserve just these little moments. There's a lot of randomness in my archives.
Yes, but you know, that randomness is going to be fascinating for folks to explore down the line. And you know, good for you for saving that conversation, even though you know you got defeated in the end. So I wanted to, I mean, that would have been hard for me to do, but you know. We're still waiting for more questions, but I had another question. Lisbet, you said something in your interview. For those of you that don't know, there is an Angela Davis Seize the Time exhibition catalog, and you can find out much more about Lisbet and her journey. But one of the things that you said was very interesting to me. You said the archive is a place of reflection. And I was hoping that you could speak a little bit more about that. And Tracy and Zakiya, feel free to chime in as well. What does that mean? The archive is a place of reflection. How does that relate to Black archives in general? And how does it relate to your experience with Angela Davis?
Is that for me?
It's for you. And Tracy and Zakiya, if you want to chime in, it's for you as well.
So I'll tell you, as someone who spent a lot of time in archives, even some of the elders in my village, like I remember my first trip to Emory's archives, where both my godfather, Matt Crawford, and his friend Louise Thompson Patterson's papers are. You know, I'd known them most of my life until they passed. And yet going through those papers, I learned about them in ways that I absolutely never knew. You know, to see their thoughts and letters to their parents, to get an understanding of who they were as people, not just aunties and, you know, elders in your village. It's like the archives are really a place to, I mean, reflect is that word, but you're able to experience and deep dive into people's lives in ways that I don't think we really can in one-on-one settings. You know, the archive, and there's also a way that you're directing your journey. You know, you have to go, you have to look at a finding aid and take a guess as to which box to pull, and, you know, what aspect of their life do you want to, you know, deep dive in. So I just find, you know, my happy place is in the stacks and in old papers and boxes and stories. And yeah, and I mean, so much of my life right now is really, I'm curating my papers. My papers are going to be fantastic. I already have, I co-founded a Black lesbian journal in the 80s, and those papers are already at the Beinecke at Yale. But my next drop, there is just going to be so much rich little nuggets. I can't, you know, I don't know. They say that when the last person says your name, that's when you really die. So I'm just hoping that there'll be something in some finding aid that will keep, you know, people requesting my papers. That's my goal.
Yes, that's beautiful. I mean, in my own research, I write about name memorials, and all it takes is just to say someone's name to keep their memory alive. So I really resonate with that. Tracy and Zakiya, I'll give you a chance to also respond. And we do have a few questions that have come in as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was so beautifully put, and I'm not sure I can say anything that articulate that will add value to that, but I'll try. But you know, you talked about archives as a place of reflection, but I also think that it can be a place of like healing and joy. You know, I've in my interactions with you know, researchers who have come in, like I remember there was a researcher one time, a student, like a high school student, and we had like all these yearbooks. Before my time here in Portland, I worked at a predominantly Black archive. And he came in and I asked him, because he was such a young guy and he was looking through all these yearbooks. And normally when folks come in looking for yearbooks, they are either there's a school class reunion coming up, or people want to just go back down memory lane. And so they're like those really fun aspects of it. And so when I asked him what he was doing, because he was looking for much older, I mean, from an earlier period in which he wasn't going to be in high school. And he was like, he said that he was looking for his father. And so for me, I was like, wow, in that one moment, I understood that archive was a place of healing for him, because one, he could get a snapshot of what who his father was in that moment in time, right? And I was like, wow, that's, you know, was a really beautiful moment. So I think that in one sense, it could be a place of healing. And then I think also, I'm also always in joy of what I find in the archives, right? So my daughter is named Zora after Zora Neale Hurston. And I was looking through some old correspondence, and I found a letter from Zora Neale Hurston that was signed by her with one of the Chicago public librarians, a correspondence between the two of them. And so I made a copy. I was so excited. And I took it home, and my kid was like able to look at this and like could see like her namesakes information in print, and like this beautifully written letter. And so like I was able to share that moment, that history, that joy with her of like what could be found in the archives. And so I just wanted to add that.
And I'll just add, first, I want to say it brings me so much joy to hear Lisbet talk about archival drops, like she's dropping a mixtape. Like, I love that so much. She's like, my next drop is gonna be fire. Like, you're not ready for this. I love that so much. And that is like now my new like thing. I need to hear that all the time when people are like, you just wait to see what I'm putting in the archive. Love that so much. Warm my heart. But I think I just want to agree that I think it is definitely a space of healing and reflection. You know, just to come across, you know, someone's experience, whether it's like yours or different from yours, it makes you think about yourself and your life in a different way. It makes you think about, you know, other people and what type of experiences informed what you think you know about a person, based on what you see in the archive. I think, you know, one of my earliest archival experiences, I can't even remember what I was even researching, but and it wasn't even an archival material that caught me, but I ran across Audre Lorde's Zammy, in an archive, and like I just sat there and read the entire book. And whatever else I was looking at, I have no idea. But in that moment, I felt so affirmed by the text that I was just like, okay, nobody can tell me shit. Like, boom, I have some of the similar experiences to Audre Lorde, you know, like this, I am completely affirmed. And it also just made me think differently about the world around me, and time, and like this difference in like our, you know, Audre Lorde would have been the same age as my grandmother, and like what that means for us to have had similar experiences where a lot of the things I experienced, I didn't have anyone to talk to as a queer woman. And so seeing that just like shape me. And I think that whether you're in the archive doing personal research or academic research, it shapes you, and it changes you in a way that you may have never expected. So I think that's just like a wonderful observation.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. I mean, we all get so much joy from this work. And so if we could share that with our friends, family, communities, the audience, hopefully that will encourage more people to engage in Black archives. So we got a lot of questions that came in. I'm going to ask you to keep your answers pretty brief so that we can touch on all the questions that have come in. The first one, or the next one rather, is for Tracy. It's from Gerry Beegan. And he says, Tracy, it's interesting to think about these practices on the ground. I believe you've done community archival work with people who had been Panthers in Chicago. And he's asking if you could tell us more about that work, which sounds very interesting.
Yeah, so when we talk about like, I'll try to keep this brief, but I think that there's a lot of labor that goes into archiving work that we don't talk about. So most of the stuff that we really talk about is the stuff, and it's organized, and it's on the table, so that people can see it, and we bring it out in these acid-free boxes and folders. But there's a lot of work that goes in before that, and that's about actually building trust and work and talking with folks. And so when I was in Chicago, I did an exhibit with the Panthers where I was able to also work with them. And so I'm still in the process of working with them, where they're gonna actually donate their material to a specific institution. They're collecting oral histories to document the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, and they also have some material. And I wanna say, when I first did the call out for my exhibit, I got very few responses. But as we grew, you know, our relationship grew, and they started to begin to grow trust with me, we had developed very close relationships. I had so much stuff by the end, I couldn't even exhibit it all. And so, you know, I just want to say that like there is labor that goes into building building relationships with communities that we don't necessarily think about, but it's there. Archivists and memory workers and all the folks that are in the communities have to do that and build that trust. And I think the first thing that we do is like not go into communities with a colonial mindset, right? One of my fellow Blackivist Raquel always says, like, we can't go in there with the hopes of taking or receiving stuff. Like, what am I giving? And so, like, one of the things that I like about the work that the Blackivist is doing is that we talk about a people-centered approach. And so we put people first. It's not about the objects. And so it is about explaining to people the process over and over again sometimes, about what that looks like. But also I think that, like, it's an education process. So I'll just leave it at that. So.
Thank you. I mean, that's such a good point, because I know Zakiya mentioned earlier the hesitancy of giving over your archives to an institution that you don't trust. So building that trust and a people-centered approach, I like that. And I think that that's definitely the way to move forward with community engagement. So the next question can be for anyone. This is from Justin Hardy. He says, I'm a social work academic researching historical Black contributions to social work and social welfare history. I'm not a historian, so I'm trying to do the best I can without a history research methods background. Can you share tips on how non-historically trained researchers can leverage Black archives in our related fields, especially in social work? And I think this could apply to anyone who is looking to do research and doesn't necessarily have the professional background.
I would just say talk to the archivists at institutions. Like, even if you don't exactly know what you're looking for or how to go about starting your research, a lot of times archivists are some of the most informed and knowledgeable people about what's in their institutions. And so they can help you work through that, believe it or not. And they are very excited to answer these questions and help you through that process. So that's what I would suggest.
And I would add that professors donate their papers to academic institutions, but also, you know, the Schomburg Center. You can find the papers of social workers where you know, they've collected materials that document their own experience and like different groups that they've been a part of. And you can kind of trace, you know, the history of Black folks in social work. And so I think that is sort of one way. And I think you can bring that work into sort of your advocacy for whatever it is that you may be experiencing in the profession, to sort of talk about, you know, we do this as Black archivists, being like, okay, you know, this is something that this person experienced 50 years ago. So like, how far have we truly come? You know, because professions like to say we've come so far, and it's like, okay, but this person experienced this 50 years ago and this happened to be yesterday. So like, let's talk about, you know, what's really going on here. So, you know, sort of bringing that into the advocacy work, into scholarship about the history of the profession and Black folks' participation in the profession. But like Tracy said, speaking to the archivists and seeing if they've done any work to document, you know, social work departments at different institutions.
Absolutely. And I would also recommend looking into Black club women. As someone who writes about them, they were the social workers for quite some time, and many still are. This is a question for Lisbet. It's from Danny Pasquarelli. During your time archiving, what discovery felt the most significant and important to Black history that impacted you personally?
Wow. So I guess I'll answer that in terms of, there's two projects that kind of I bumped into that will forever just be foremost in my mind. The first was Black lesbian poet Pat Parker was a mentor in the last year of her life, working on a Black lesbian journal. And after she passed, her partner asked for my help in putting her papers together. And while going through her papers, I found 20 years of correspondence between her and Audre Lorde, chronicling they were the only Black poets in the white poetry scene, married to white men, to coming out, all the way through to supporting each other through cancer. And at the time, nothing was to be done to her papers while their daughter was so young, but she allowed me to make a copy of that correspondence as long as I didn't do anything with it. And maybe 15, 20 years later, a friend and I produced an event based on that conversation. And it was recently published, the letters between Pat and Audre. And, you know, it wasn't quite a discovery, but it was just another aha moment as to how rich something like that could be. You know, letters, postcards. You know, I can't remember which one of them, but they like to draw doodles of like Daffy Duck and, you know, stuff like that. The other thing was maybe a couple years ago, I started getting calls from the storage locker guys. There's a whole cottage industry and people losing their materials for not paying their, and somehow I've been tasked with recovering these lockers. So these guys just had my name and number as somebody who was involved in Black material. And there is an actor who was probably the most recognizable Black face on television growing up. His name was Brock Peters. Probably his biggest role, well, he was in Porgy and Bess, Carmen Jones, To Kill a Mockingbird. And his papers were floating around a flea market in Long Beach and being sold over here and being sold over there. And I was kind of watching all of this go by. And anyway, I ended up devoting 1.5 years in my life to kind of tracking all the material down and being able to resurrect what was an incredible legacy. I think of, you know, we may think of him as an entertainment figure, but he was co-founder of the Dance Theater of Harlem. He was chairman of the board of the SNCC's Free Southern Theater. He just had tremendous, he and his wife, Dolores, had a tremendous legacy, and being able to save those papers. And now they're at Emory and all that history. So, you know, it's not my story, but I feel like I'm part of the story. And now when I see him on TV, to know that I'm connected to his legacy just feels like such an important nugget. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And we have a comment from Stephanie Lanoff that says, the relationship or relationships that are saved through this process, you've saved relationships by keeping papers. I want to go to our closing question, but before I do, I want to ask kind of a institutional practical question from Latanya Autry, who says she's wondering about supporting costs for storing materials, in particular digital materials, especially in light of how many communities are posting things online, but they aren't printing their content. How should we save those online posts, videos, images, especially when funds are low and people are living with precarity?
I'll just quickly say that I began as a digital archivist, and I came out all the way on the other side that I really need it printed out on paper. You know, things like social media. You know, I print annual yearbooks of my social media feed. So much of our life happens virtually now. So I would say that for digital collections, you really need to do your research about 321 and how to best save that. But I'm still feeling that for many things, I really need a hard copy.
Yes, and I see that Tracy and Zakiya are co-signing and saying that social media is not an archive. So yes, printed materials or preserving in another way is definitely the way to go. I want to thank my former colleague, Jesse Baker, for submitting a question. And he asked, and I think we can think about, things to leave our audience with tonight with this question. He asked, whose work in collecting and preserving Black history inspires you? What groups or institutions are doing great work in this space right now? And what can people think about in terms of the future of Black archives?
That's a big question. So I think that there are a ton of groups that are in projects, and I can't mention them all, but hopefully Zakiya will get some if I forget some. But like folks like Documenting the Now are doing stuff in the digital realm of collecting material. And I think that they also supply you with tools and resources that you can use that should be free and open access to archiving some of that stuff. I think about the folks at Witness who are documenting human rights abuses like all across the world as a great organization. I'm thinking about the last program that we went to, and I think Zakiya was on it about archiving the Black web. And so they are really Zakiya can talk more about that because I will let you talk about it.
Well, I'll just say that I am big admirers of my co-panelists' work, for one. So, continue to look into and support their work, and Tracy and the Blackivist. Anytime that I can big up the Blackivist, I'm happy to do so. I'll talk about Archiving the Black Web, which is which was a 2-day program to really think about and in conversation with social media scholars, with content creators, with archivists and librarians to really think about what does it mean to archive Black content from online, with Black folks sort of leading online trends and on TikTok, on Twitter, Black Twitter, sort of like, what does it mean to collect that content and how can we be strategic about it? And there's more work to come from that. So continue to follow Archiving the Black Web. My sister, Lael Hughes, with Project Stand. My other sister, Sarita Gates, with the Gates Preserve, which is sort of doing hip hop archiving. Like Tracy said, you can't get everyone, but yeah, I'm gonna leave it there.
Yeah, if I can just say one more thing about what I see the future of Black archives, I would think that what I would hope is that the future of Black archives looks like more communities taking charge of their own narratives and preservation. And what I mean by that is much like the model that Lisbet has thrown out there for us, is that individuals are here preserving that, and that also like it's a lot of work to go outside your community to larger institutions to visit archives. So I'm hoping that people are like going into community centers, right, in their neighborhood, like it's up the street from me, right? So that it's for us and by us, and it's within our community, so that I don't have to take 2 trains and a bus downtown to get to an archive. And that doesn't mean that I'm not grateful that institutions exist, that these larger institutions exist, because they should, but I think that there should also be a way for communities to preserve and document themselves and control the narratives themselves. So for me, that's what I see the future of Black archives. And I hope that like folks like the Mellon Foundation, who has funded the Blackivist, and other organizations step up and fund more projects like that.
Absolutely. And Lisbet, I mean, do you have any final words you want to leave our audience with about, you know, things that you're looking into right now or the future of Black archives?
Ooh.
Which is a big question, I know.
Yeah, you know, I actually, I'm just having a moment. I just got back from actually seeing the exhibit for the first time. And I've had kind of my own internal story as I look at just the volume of the material that I gathered. And, you know, part of it is a little embarrassing. It's like, you know, there is so much in there. And, you know, it almost feels like an end of a chapter. So I'm actually kind of scanning the universe for my next project, but there's so much fodder here that you've given me. I have like 3 pages worth of things to go look up. So yeah, I don't have any more to add right now. Just gratitude for being in this circle and, you know, communing over something that I love.
We are certainly grateful for you and the work that you have done, the work that you're continuing to do. It's inspirational and certainly a call to action to all of us. So thank you. And thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Zakiya, for the excellent work that you are doing in the profession and continuing to tell us that we do matter, our stories matter, and our lives should be preserved for generations to come. I want to thank our audience for such wonderful questions. Please look in the chat for links and all kinds of resources. Know that there are a couple more programs coming up that the Zimmerle Art Museum is hosting in terms of thinking about Black archives and these issues. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to these amazing panelists for being here. And I look forward to continuing to be in solidarity and sisterhood with you all and continuing to do the great work. Thank you. Good evening and good night.